Thanks for staying with us. Let's go to this now. Reports suggest there are ceasefire talks that have been extended for another day in Cairo. Now, Hamas negotiators will remain in Cairo for another day as there is still no breakthrough. Now, these talks are crucial as some are pinning their hopes on the possibility of a ceasefire agreement ahead of Ramadan. Let's get more details now. Correspondent Alex Cadier, you saw him earlier on, is in Tel Aviv for us and joins us live now. Alex, thank you so much for your time this evening. An extension of another day. We're also hearing that Israel and Hamas are blaming each other for stalling the ceasefire talks. What else do we know?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. As night falls here in Tel Aviv, that extension, that extra day is also wrapping up. And so far, we don't have a breakthrough. We heard earlier in the day that Hamas said that they had put their proposal on the table and the ball was in Israel's court. Well, the very latest we have just in the last hour or so is from the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, saying it is now for Hamas to accept the ceasefire proposals that are on the table. It would be both a 6-week ceasefire and an exchange of Israeli hostages being held in Gaza and Palestinian prisoners. That is what is on the table. It would allow for those hostages to be freed, of course, and for humanitarian aid to flow into Gaza. We heard Antony Blinken putting pressure on Israel, saying that they had to maximize all efforts to allow aid into Gaza. So at the moment, there is still fragile optimism with 5 days until that March 10th deadline that a deal can be reached, although it hasn't yet been reached. We've seen Egyptian media, I should say, reporting that the talks were facing some difficulties. You would expect that, but crucially, the talks have not collapsed, and all sides will be working very hard to reach a deal as quickly as possible.
And Alex, all of this is happening as the United Nations published a troubling report related to the Israeli hostages that are being held in Gaza. The special envoy on sexual violence and conflict saying that some hostages held by Hamas have been subjected to rape and sexual torture. What else do we know?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I have to say for our viewers that it is both graphic and disturbing, the elements out of that UN report and the reporting from the United Nations confirming that there is clear and convincing evidence that rape and sexualized torture was committed against some of those those hostages being held in Gaza by Hamas and by other groups, including allegations of rape and gang rape. And that possibly most worryingly, those acts described by the UN as cruel and inhuman are still ongoing. There is evidence that those acts are still ongoing, and that gives you the sense, particularly here from an Israeli perspective, about the urgency of getting those hostages out. Israel had been putting a lot of pressure on the United Nations to investigate these allegations. The UN now has done so and says that there is clear and convincing evidence that rape and sexual violence have been committed against those hostages being held in Gaza. That gives you the backdrop of the concern of the families here in Israel. Of course, the suffering in Gaza, the atrocious humanitarian catastrophe, as it was described by the US Vice President Kamala Harris, is ongoing in Gaza. That is the human suffering behind all of this. That is what's at stake in those ceasefire talks as we look to Cairo for a possible resolution.
And it circles us back, Alex, to our earlier point, even about how difficult then these negotiations become, especially in the face of, this particular report, and also what yesterday you and I were talking about as far as Israel is concerned when it comes to its hostages, but also the desperate situation in Gaza, over 100 people also being killed when that aid truck was trying to deliver aid there.
Yeah, and we've seen reports actually in the last few days that other Palestinian civilians were killed trying to access food, trying to access aid in the Gaza Strip, and that Israeli forces opened fire. And that is, again, the level of violence, level of destruction in Gaza, the desperate situation there. We've seen footage coming out of Gaza of people trying to clear rubble with their bare hands, trying to pull people out of the rubble, out of collapsed buildings as Israel's military operation in the Gaza Strip continues. That is the level of suffering. And we've seen from the WHO just in the last few days saying that an increasing number of children are dying of dehydration, malnutrition in the Gaza Strip, dying in hospital, which shows you how depleted those hospitals are, as if they're unable to keep children alive. That is the real profound pain and suffering going on in Gaza at the moment. And you also have pain and suffering in Israel for those families desperate to see their loved ones returned, particularly when you see the violence violence. So that is, of course, the suffering that underpins these negotiations. But of course, these are two warring sides, and the Israeli government has repeatedly said their objective is the complete eradication of Hamas. Hamas is a negotiating party in these ceasefire talks, and that shows you the really difficult nature of these talks as they carry on.
Alex, thank you so much for that update, and let's see if the extension does, if at all, move the needle somewhat, and of course we'll continue to watch it through your eyes. That's SABC News correspondent Alex Cadier.